Good morning. This is Truth Seeker here, and it's another dreary day. We had some pretty hard thunderstorms last night. We had a crash of lightning that happened next door. One of those types of lightning strikes where you see the flash and hear the sound at the same time. And boy, was it loud. It scared the heck out of everybody in the house. But yeah, we had a couple of really bad thunderstorms last night. I guess maybe God's trying to tell me something, right? Thor, the thunder god. Zeus, the god of thunder. They're all angry at me. Primitive man, when they didn't know what these things were, how nature worked, assumed that there was a whole other sphere of living entities who were in control of these things. And we're still living with that legacy. It's only been 300 years, 400 years, since the beginning of the scientific method. And even those responsible for the scientific method, like Isaac Newton, were deeply superstitious, deeply religious. I mean, you've heard of Pascal's wager. Pascal was one of the most brilliant mathematical minds to have walked the earth, and he chose a religious path in his life. And it's not the IQ, it's not the intelligence of a person that's involved in belief. It's a very strange situation with humans having to feel comfortable that something is in control of our lives and something is going to watch over us and over our welfare. And we need some sort of comfort. It's almost as if we, as a species, are in our infancy, and we need the protection, like of an adult, a higher power. To a little child, their parents are infinitely wise, the infinite protector. I look at my grandson, and he's already, at a stage when he gets in trouble with us. He starts saying, "I want mommy. I want my daddy." And that is interesting because he's looking for protection. Who's going to protect him from the trouble he's in? And I'm certain when he's in trouble at home, he does the same thing. But that's just nature. That's just natural. So, I know this has been a long series. I think that the Bible students and the Jehovah's Witnesses are a very unique, even more unique than other religions, and like Mormonism or Seventh-day Adventism, because of the certainty I guess, with which not only the certainty with which people who got caught into the Watchtower web believe the doctrines are truth, but the degree to which one was willing to allow the movement, the culture, to dominate their life. Right from the get-go, Russell advocated for a complete submission to God. Well, you can't see God, you can't talk to God, and so who's the next best thing? Well, the Laodicean messenger, the person who brings the message of truth to everybody. And they're visible, tangible beings, creatures that you can see, touch, hear, and relate to. So you give your loyalty over to them. When they say God demands a full consecration, that you give up all your hopes and desires, all of your worldly goods, all of your aims, and sacrifice them for God's greater plan. Well, God didn't tell that to you directly. It was his messenger that brought that message to you. And he's the one that tells you how your life should be lived. And so you're living your life for that tangible representation. And so you're really giving up your life for this individual. But there were so many weird things. Of all of the religions that have actually become successful, and when I mean successful, that the religion has grown to the point where there's worldwide knowledge of them, global knowledge of them. They may not have nearly the numbers as Catholics. Catholics had a chance to, for 1,000 years, to as a single or almost single Christian sect, to convert people into Catholicism after the hundreds of little sects finally sorted things out. I guess it was actually Constantine who kind of sorted it out for them, and which sect really ended up dominant in the end. And until the Protestant Revolution, the Martin Luther posting his 95 Theses, there was no opposition to the Catholic Church, and they were the sole Christian aside from the Eastern Orthodox, because there was a schism between them, but Catholicism was almost the only game in town concerning Christians, and so they had a chance to dominate and grow. Your children, or you're Catholic, your children are then automatically Catholic. So there's no that guarantees, especially when there are no other options, and if you're even thinking of an option, they burn you at the stake. You're gonna support your local parish. So But Catholicism over the years, especially the last 50 years, has kind of succumbed to the pressures of modern world, and actually may be really the most malleable and lenient of the main Christian religions, mainstream Christian religions. Protestantism is becoming increasingly fundamental, so it seems. At least here in the United States, the Protestant sects, especially the evangelical sects, are becoming more steeped, more extreme in their fundamentalism. But the Seventh-day Adventists, the Mormons, and the Watchtower all arose in the 19th century and became successful religions in that they made pretty big headway in a world that really only had 2 or 3 different religious options, really. I mean, yeah, you Lutheranism, you had some Methodism, you had Calvinism, Presbyterians, but you know, there really isn't that terribly much difference between the different Protestant sects. There may be 1 or 2 doctrines: predestination versus you're saved, predestined to be saved. I think that's Calvinism, and then there are those that believe that you have to work for your salvation to prove to God that you're worthy of the salvation. But surprisingly, these other religions, they found flaws in the mainstream religions. I mean, when you stop and you think about it, even Protestantism isn't that terribly different from Catholicism. It's a reformation of the fundamental Catholic Church. The Catholic Church had become quite, let's say, elaborate in money-making schemes, building ostentatious churches and cathedrals, pomp, the pomp of even the priests in their garb, and the nuns and the whole works. And the Protestants, they really were against the culture that developed over 1,000 or so years in the Catholic Church. Not so much the teachings. And, you know, the teachings, the doctrines were pretty much the same, fundamentally. They didn't contest the idea of a hell. In fact, they endorsed hellfire. Hellfire was something that the Catholic Church derived way back. The Trinity was derived under Catholicism. And these things were retained in the doctrinal suite of beliefs of Protestantism. They didn't change. They kept the same beliefs. It was the pomp, the money, the culture that they objected to. And so what was different about religions like Mormonism and Adventism and eventually the Watchtower, the Bible students, is that they came up with markedly different doctrinal beliefs in the 19th century. And marketing those ideas, it seemed that the iron was hot to to convince people that to draw them out of the mainstream religions. And over the course of their work and their history, we're able to draw in millions of people. I think Adventism has 18 million. The Seventh-day Adventists. Now, there were a lot of different forms of Adventism, Second Adventists, that came out of the Miller movement. William Miller was the first Adventist in the 1830s, made predictions, didn't happen, and it was the great disappointment, and it splintered. The groups all splintered, and it looked like that might be it for Adventism until Ellen White, one sect grew out of that, and that became our modern day Seventh-day Adventists. And they have historical roots in William Miller, but they don't believe in they don't mess around with time prophecies, at least like Miller did, or other Adventists, or the Watchtower, which kind of grew out of Adventism. It was heavily influenced by Adventists, but Russell was very heavily influenced by Adventists. And I never realized how strongly Russell's beliefs were influenced by Adventists. In fact, almost all of the doctrinal matters that he believed were fundamental to the truth were pretty much Adventist ideas. There were many different Adventists, and he picked an idea from here and an idea from there, and he just kind of pulled them all together. And that's where the Watchtower really originated. And he was able to convince a lot of people to join his group, at least enough to create a core that resulted into an organization that eventually grew into the millions. At least a brand of belief systems, a sect of the Watchtower that grew into the millions, the Jehovah's Witnesses. But the time was right, and people didn't understand enough about science at the time. Science wasn't well known. People weren't really educated in science. It was sort of its own little world, and academically, it was really kind of the realm of academia. It didn't permeate into everyday life. Some of the inventions that came out of the scientific revolution did. Manufacturing methods using machines. I just got to sign the little battery. I'm going to have to go plug in, so I'll stop here for a second. Hi there, back again. Anyway, just wanted to give a little bit of a backdrop for the reason why we're even here talking about this, because these movements came along at a time when people were susceptible. They wanted something new. People were becoming a little more educated. Literacy was increasing. Education was teaching people how to read and write. There's a marked difference between, at least in the United States, between the early 19th century and the later 19th century in terms of literacy. People began, there was a public school system that was established, and people began to think about the fallacies that they began to see in their historic religions, the Catholic religion, the Protestants that basically followed the Catholicism, at least doctrinally, and these new religions struck a chord in people. I also think that the Civil War had something to do with people's religiosity during the 19th century. There was so much death, so much tragedy that struck, especially in the middle to late part of the 19th century, that people wanted some hope, wanted salvation. They wanted to see their loved ones again, and their traditional religions didn't really offer them that much hope. And so religions that said we were near the end times, and that a new world order was on its way, appealed to people because they believed that all this death and all of these terrible things that they saw happen and touched their lives. I mean, in the United States, at the time of the Civil War, the whole population of the country was only a little over 30 million, and 9 million in the South, and the remainder in the North, and there were over 600,000 deaths that transpired as a result of that, and many more terribly maimed or injured. And so the war touched everybody in some way, and people weren't ready to accept what salvation offered in the traditional sense. And that's so these newer religions that popped up gave a hope that was missing. And I think that's one of the reasons why they became more popular and began to grow, especially when you stop and you think about how strange it is. Now, one of the things that Russell pointed out was the deficiency of the creeds, that the creeds were not really Bible oriented, let's say, or based. These were doctrinal teachings that were derived by the church, but there really wasn't any scriptural basis for them, and he pointed that out. Now, interestingly enough, Russell's following remained relatively small through his life. It grew, and it grew into tens of thousands by the time he died. But the movement was still relatively small by the time he died. But he was still the most well-known preacher probably in the world at the time, because of the syndication of his teachings in the newspapers. The newspaper was the only media for information during the early 20th century, late 19th century. And he was published worldwide. So while he didn't have that many followers, he did have quite a bit of fame and notoriety. People knew him, knew who he was. I think one of the reasons why the movement was not as popular was mainly because of the demands. His teachings focused in on those who would be part of the 144,000. Well, the 144,000 really is a very small number when you compare it to over 1 billion people in the world at the time. And so you wouldn't expect, he didn't expect that he was going to create a movement that had 1 million followers, because that would run against his idea of what the purpose of his work was, which was to gather and filter out those who would be part of the 144,000. That was his ministry exclusively. And you can't have a following of millions of people when there's only a prize for so many. It's like playing musical chairs with 200 people and 5 chairs, and so your doctrines, your teachings, you're going to just limit the number of people who are interested. And then also the degree to which sacrifice was required. Sacrifice, and he emphasized this, that those that would qualify for the high calling, as he called it, 144,000, would have to basically give up their lives and give up everything, make the call to the high calling, to the 144,000, the one and only purpose in your life. You give up everything else, family and possessions and worldly aspirations. Those were incompatible, he taught, with God's intentions. You had to give all to God in your consecration, which was symbolized by baptism. And so I don't think there it had tremendous appeal. But those that did follow him were really loyal to him. And that was the problem that Rutherford faced. Now, Rutherford and his cohorts, William Van Amberg and Macmillan, I believe, saw what I think Russell was a little disappointed. By the end of his life, he felt that maybe his ministry was misdirected. And he had called Macmillan into his office and told Macmillan of his vision of the Watchtower, and that it had a greater work to do. Now, he wasn't very specific about that greater work, but apparently he believed that the work of the Watchtower was not done, that it had to grow into a worldwide organization, a worldwide message, which it hadn't really done at that point. And Macmillan points that out. And there's a talk that you can find on YouTube. You can also find that in Macmillan's book, Faith of the March. And so I think at the time that Russell died, he had a different vision, a different idea of what the Watchtower really should be as an organization. And Macmillan and Van Amberg read what Russell wanted, and so did Rutherford. Can't go by that as Bible students do. Go back to that will. That will was outdated. It wasn't updated. It was 10 years old. I mean, I find it interesting that Rutherford was even in the will at all. I mean, he had just joined the Bible students in 1906, and he's listed in Russell's will already as an alternate for the editorial committee. So Russell already was very impressed with Rutherford and his capabilities. What people think about Rutherford and his relationship to Russell, I don't get it. I don't think that they necessarily are correct, because that will is meaningless. You might as well just forget it, because people's minds change dramatically from year to year, and this will was over 10 years old. So that was, I mean, it identified people who were dead, like John Edgar. I don't know if I had mentioned this, but John Edgar was John and Morton Edgar. They were pyramidians, as some would note. They wrote exclusively on the pyramids. They took Russell's interest in the pyramid and they ran with it, and they printed volumes of treatises on the pyramid and its measurements and what it meant, and they went pyramid nuts. Now, John Edgar, who was a medical doctor, gynecologist, he died in 1912. So 4 years before Russell's death, and he was still in the will. Morton Edgar lived until around 1950, and he continued to be the definitive Bible student word on the Great Pyramid. Bible students still bought into the Great Pyramid well into my lifetime, including today. Speaking of which, the Bible Students General Convention started yesterday and will continue through this week and end Thursday. Thursday is the last day. Johnstown, Pennsylvania. So if you look up, you can actually link online. They're now posting talks on YouTube. But we did talk about the transition period. We did talk about some of the things that occurred during the 1920s. And I believe that probably would have occurred anyway had Russell lived, because I think Russell's idea and vision of the movement was changing. There was evidence of that already. He had already printed in the Watchtower that you'd go out of the truth if you deviated from the Watchtower teachings. So he didn't advocate for independent Bible study. He also interestingly enough, in the Proclaimer's book, I found something very interesting. Now again, the Proclaimer's book is very biased, and there's a lot of lying by omission in the Proclaimer's book. But there was one thing there that was interesting, and the Watchtower offered up what they called a pilgrim service, and I'm going to have to wait a minute until this helicopter passes. Oh, the cloud layer is so low. Oh, there it is. Yeah, that's good. Loud. For some reason, they decide to fly over my house on Sunday mornings. But The Proclaimer's book mentioned something, contains something that I found very interesting. There was, not only from what Macmillan indicated about him being offered the presidency and him having a 2-hour discussion with Russell just before his death about Russell's vision for the future and how he believed that there was a great work that needed to be done by the Watchtower, and that it wasn't done yet, and that there was still a worldwide growth that had to take place, and I believe this. Russell, before he died, there were speaker representatives. They called them pilgrim speakers, and the Watchtower would get requests from ecclesias throughout the United States and other parts of the world, and they would send representatives to come and serve these classes. They'd go out and they'd give a talk and represented the Watchtower. And that service was called the Pilgrim Service. Later on, it was identified as the ordained ministers, but in later years, as the movement matured and began printing yearbooks, in 1927, they printed a yearbook covering the year 1926. There's a list in there that I've shown in previous videos called the Pilgrim List. And these were speakers that were representatives of the Watchtower. Now, to be a speaker that qualified for being a representative of the Watchtower on the Pilgrim Speakers List, you had to pass a test. And there was a test that included essay questions. It included true and false. I was really surprised to see this. To think that they were testing actually coming up with a test that an individual had to pass. These were essay questions, very subjective. I mean, how could someone grade the answers? And they were all doctrinal matters. They were all questions that were specific doctrinal teachings of the Watchtower, and you had to elaborate on them. Now, all one had to do was just spit out something from the Watchtower or spit something out of the studies in the scriptures, and you had the answer correct. And but you had to pass a test, and you had to score an 80% correct in order to to qualify for Pilgrim Speaker. So they were beginning to incorporate these measures of control. That's the point of it. And I think they were rolling in that direction, even during Russell's life. So it wasn't Rutherford. Rutherford just continued, maybe accelerated the rate at which the Watchtower infiltrated itself into the ecclesias, controlling the ecclesias, controlling people's lives. It's possible that it could have even occurred if Russell had lived. If Russell had continued to live through the 20s, I'm sure he would have come up with some kind of a doctrine where, we misunderstood the great company, just like Rutherford. They already had one major doctrinal change during Russell's life over the covenants, and it didn't result into the disaster that Russell was afraid would happen. People accepted it because Russell said it. Now, there were a few, but out of the thousands of Bible students there were around the world, maybe a couple hundred, several hundred left as a result of the change that he made in the covenant. So people were more inclined to listen to Russell, and I think the whole movement probably would have gone the way it's gone today, the way it gone the way the Jehovah's Witnesses have gone. Had it been Russell, there wouldn't have been a split. I think Russell would have kept enough influence over the movement where at least the vast majority of the movement would have gone with his changes, gone along with them. And Russell, he could have easily lived into the 1930s. He was only 64 when he passed away. So he had plenty of time during the 20s and 30s, if he had lived, to make these changes. And I don't think that there would have been as much division, splitting, turmoil as there was. First off, he wasn't the same kind of person as Rutherford. Rutherford, people really gave him either support or despised him. He was the kind of man where people had extremes in terms of their either liking him or not. For example, Hayden Covington idolized Rutherford, whereas a lot of the Bible students who were loyal to Russell felt Rutherford betrayed Russell, and firmly believed that. But the majority of the movement left. The majority of Bible students, of the original Bible students, left their association with the Watchtower as a result of Rutherford directly and his teachings, his changing of the teachings. And Rutherford had support. He had A.H. Macmillan, who was an important person, William Van Amberg, who was important, and they stayed loyal to the Watchtower, and they stayed loyal to Rutherford, because I think they knew that he was doing what Russell ultimately wanted done, although Rutherford had his own ideas about deifying people, and I think that's one of the reasons why he really was so much against creature worship, was because of the fact that there was a lot of resistance to the changes that he was incorporating into the doctrines, because of the movement's loyalty to Russell and his teachings. The Watchtower printed the Studies in the Scriptures until 1927. And that's 10 years after Russell's death. They continued to print the Studies in the Scriptures. There were some edits, but it was pretty much the same as how Russell originally wrote them. They had a stockpile of these that they continued to sell into the 1930s. So it wasn't like they necessarily dropped Russell altogether. I mean, they were selling what books they had left. So they didn't deem Russell's teachings dangerous enough to undermine what was going on with the movement or with the Watchtower as late as the 1930s. I think they finally did sell them their reserve of Studies in the Scriptures out by the 1930s, early 30s. I think by the time they had changed the name to Jehovah's Witnesses um, in 1931, I think they weren't selling the studies in the scriptures by that point. But they didn't stop selling them immediately after they went out of print. They were still selling them upon request. Um, a lot of the really key doctrinal changes occurred after the name change to Jehovah's Witness. Some of the really significant ones, like Adam and Eve not getting a resurrection, that really had an effect on the ransom doctrine, and there were an awful lot of Bible students who were still associated with the Watchtower Society, who by the end of the 1930s had decided to leave and join the defecting Bible students, the main group of Bible students who defected out. Now, I had thrown some numbers up in the last video that showed that by the mid-1920s there was a fairly sizable number of people attending Memorial. It's somewhat of a guess, but certainly 90,000 Memorial attendees doesn't reflect how many were consecrated. Anywhere between a half and 75%, maybe 45 to maybe 60, 70,000, you could guess, were consecrated out of that 90,000. And that number dropped off significantly in 1928. I showed information on the Pilgrim speakers that between 1929 and 1928 there was a wholesale switchover. Over 40% of the Pilgrims list were gone. The names that were there in 1928 were gone. New names were added, and you wouldn't notice it unless you really did a close comparison of the names. All you would see is a list of names. You would have to compare the names from one year to the next, and you could see that there was this large exodus. I think it wasn't only an exodus. I think there were many that just left. Now, of these, there were some from a Bible student's perspective, there were some very notable figures. And you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out with that speakers list and point out a couple of names. Now, these guys were associated with Watchtower, and I knew these people. I'm going to put up that Pilgrim list from the 1928, I think it is, 1928 Pilgrim speakers list, or the 1928 yearbook with the names of the Pilgrim speakers. They did list them. This is a copy from the 1929 yearbook, and this is just the beginning of a list of names. On it, I know a couple of the names here. There's Macaulay, J.Y. Macaulay. He was an elder in the class that I was attending. There was John Dawson, J. Dawson. Further down the list was G.R. Pollock and N. Woodworth, W.N. Woodworth. And he liked to be called Norman Woodworth. Actually, when I was a kid, he wanted us little kids to call him Woody for his last name, Woodworth. So the reason I show you this is that in 1930, these names no longer show up on the list. Pollock, Zanow, Woodworth, Macaulay. Macaulay actually remained with the society until about 1939, and then his name no longer sits on the list. Dawson, Rice, which is actually a relative of mine. My dad's older sister married into the Rice family. Some of the Rices are missing from this list in 1930. So the list names changed radically between 1929 and 1930 because of the Great Exodus that took place in 1928. Now, the reason I show you this list is because I want you to check it out for yourselves if you need proof that those names were indeed associated with the Watchtower. They were very, very integral to the work of the Watchtower. And they became important individuals in the regathering or the retrenching of the reformation or reformation of the Bible students movement after 1928. Now, I've just thrown up some pictures here. This one in particular shows Norman Woodworth on the left. Now, Norman Woodworth was really to the Bible students, to the Dawn Bible students, and to the Bible students that formed after 1928, 1929, sort of a second Russell in a sense. He was the person around whom people rallied. He had been involved in the photodrama of creation. He was a projectionist. He teamed up with A.H. Macmillan, so he knew Macmillan very well. In fact, Macmillan was one of the early influences for Woodworth in his conversion, let's say, into the Bible students. Apparently, Woodworth's father, there's a biography, an autobiography of Woodworth online, a small one. And Woodworth's father, by the 1890s, was already involved in the Bible students' teachings. He had a number of the volumes, and that influenced Norman Woodworth as a boy. But then as a young man, Macmillan had come through Nova Scotia. Now, Woodworth was born and raised in Nova Scotia. His father had a wood mill up there in a town called Berwick, Nova Scotia. And Macmillan was also a Canadian. And so they made a connection there. And they did team up later on the photodrama of creation. Macmillan was the keynote speaker, and Woodworth was the projectionist for the photodrama. And later, Woodworth had a short hiatus from the work at the Bethel. His wife, he actually met his wife while working on the photodrama of creation, and apparently she got sick and died, and that took him away from the Watchtower for a while. But then he returned to the Watchtower and got involved in the radio work. Now, according to the bibliography or biography of, what am I saying, bibliography? Biography of Woodworth, the initial call sign for the radio station, for the Watchtower radio station, was WORD, but I don't know. I couldn't find anything about that. All I know is WBBR, and I know that he worked on Staten Island in association with the radio work with WBBR. He was both in an orchestra. For a while they featured an orchestra. He played the trombone, and he also sponsored a program or featured a program with John Dawson called Frank and Ernest on WBBR. And apparently he got into trouble with Rutherford over some of the things that he was saying on air, which were trickling back to Rutherford. And by that point in time, he was already not very happy with the way things were going with the Watchtower under Rutherford. So he and John Dawson began exploring some of the other Bible student classes in the New York area that had years previous disassociated themselves from the Watchtower. Rutherford called them disloyal Bible students, and he labeled them the evil servant. These were PBI members, Pastoral Bible Institute. I don't think Woodworth was ever interested in the Layman's Home Missionary under P.S.L. Johnson, because they were teaching that P.S.L. Johnson was the last of the 144,000 of the high calling, and that the door was shut. And Woodworth didn't believe that. Woodworth believed that the call to the high calling, or the door to the high calling, was still open. And so he associated with a class, or he explored a class, Bible student class, not associated with Watchtower, that taught that. And it was originally a PBI class that met in Brooklyn. And word got back to Rutherford that not only was Woodworth reluctant to broadcast the new teachings, but that he and Dawson had explored, attended defectors class, a class that were comprised of defectors, and that was an embarrassment to Rutherford. So Rutherford, apparently, when the word got to him that Woodworth had, mind you, this is the cousin of Clayton Woodworth, who was pretty high up in the Watchtower organization, a very close associate of Rutherford. He had written the 7th volume. He edited the Golden Age magazine. And so Clayton Woodworth was an important individual in the society, and as well as Norman Woodworth. Norman Woodworth was a pilgrim speaker. He was on that list, and he also was involved in the WBBR radio work. And so Rutherford, when he found out, and again, this is according, you can find Woodworth's autobiography online, the Herald prints it. But according to Woodworth, Rutherford called him into his office and asked him if it was true that he had met with disloyal brethren. And Woodworth acknowledged that he had. And then dismissed him from the office and called him back a little later and confronted Woodworth with the entire board of directors of the Watchtower. And they queried him. They asked him, are you loyal to the Watchtower or not? And Woodworth replied that he had learned explicitly from Russell that the truth was no man's or no organization's purview, that the truth was God's alone. And so they disfellowshipped him. They shunned him. All the Bethel family was, this happened in the morning. Apparently he wasn't even permitted to stay through lunch. They kicked him out before lunch. And Bethel brethren were instructed not to speak to Woodworth, and so that was it for him and his association with the Watchtower. Woodworth was then decided that this was the Lord's will for him, and that he begin his service to the Lord in another avenue, which was through the Bible student brethren that he had met in Brooklyn, and he started attending that class. Well, he, again, he's the individual all the way to the left of this photograph. The person to the right is George Wilson, who was a prominent Bible student. And the individual in the middle is Don Copeland. And the three of them here are broadcasting the Frank and Ernest radio program. Now, Woodworth had spearheaded an effort in the New York or the Brooklyn ecclesia to independently sponsor and reinstate the Frank and Ernest radio program, and convinced the New York Bible students to spend money to put together 13 radio broadcasts with the goal in mind to reach out to brethren that had left the Watchtower but had nowhere to meet, and were scattered as a result of their leaving the Watchtower and not knowing where to go. And so Woodworth, along with Wilson, reinstated the Frank and Ernest program, and Copeland. And this is the trio that initially started Frank and Ernest radio. Woodworth on the left was Frank. George Wilson on the right was Ernest. And it was a question and answer type format. And Dawson, or Copeland in the middle, was the moderator. The reason I said Dawson is while Frank and Ernest was being sponsored by the Watchtower, John Dawson was Ernest, whereas Woodworth was Frank. I suspect that the Frank and Ernest radio program did not run very long while under the Watchtower. Rutherford gave them permission to take the show. He didn't give them trouble when they reinstated it under different independent Bible student control. So I'm surprised that Rutherford gave them that leeway, didn't stop them from using the name Frank and Ernest, because it would have been something that former Bible students would have recognized, and so it would have reached out to those that were disaffected, disenfranchised from the Watchtower, and would have gathered them or allowed them to find a point of contact to regather together. Wilson and Woodworth were also very involved in the very first Bible Students Reunion Convention. Now, this is a photograph that I pulled off of the Dawn Publishing's website. They have a little history of their organization, and this photograph was located in the segment that discussed the 1929 convention. So this, I assume, is and I'm pretty certain of it, is a photograph that was taken of that first Bible Students Reunion Convention in 1929. And that was largely organized by George Wilson and Norman Woodworth, among other brethren. But they were two of the prominent brethren at that time that organized that convention. And there were several hundred that joined that convention. And they decided to hold a convention every year thereafter. Now, this convention was held in November of 1929. And the interesting thing, or one of the interesting things, is that this convention was held at the old Bible House, which was it predated the Bethel. This was where Russell's work was. The Bethel family, they were the Bible House family when Watchtower was headquartered in Allegheny, Pennsylvania. And I guess Watchtower had, by that point, sold off the old Bible House properties, and it was still there, and I guess they could lease or rent the property for this convention. And this is a photograph of it, and apparently it was quite successful. People were happy to be away from the Watchtower because of Rutherford and his dictatorial, his very autocratic ways. It was his way or the highway, and he had demanded loyalty to the organization as opposed to the freedom of autonomy that each of the classes and the Bible students had under Russell. That was something that was increasing as time went along. The Watchtower was gaining increasing control over the individual ecclesias that were Bible student ecclesias that were associated with Watchtower. And already by this point, you had the Layman's Home Missionary, you had the PBI, the Pastoral Bible Institute, and this is on the verge or the threshold of the Dawn Bible Students Association. The PBI was sort of an eclectic mix of Bible students who had diverse beliefs, and the Dawn, some of them were quite different from what Charles Russell taught, and so the Dawn really was a re-establishment of the movement as it was during Russell's day, or at the time Russell passed away. The Dawn Bible Students Association really did a great work. Not great, I'm not advocating that work, but I said did let's say, a notable work in regathering many of the disaffected Bible students. The Layman's Home Missionary really wasn't targeting Bible students that were leaving, who were leaving in droves from the Watchtower. They were looking elsewhere. They didn't believe the way that many believed that they were anointed. P.S.L. Johnson believed that he was the last of the anointed. And so that did not appeal to most of the Bible students who were leaving the Watchtower, who were already under the belief that they were part of the anointed. And so that's where the Dawn came in. The Dawn appealed to those who still believe that as they in their nomenclature, the door to the high calling was still open. And so that's the Dawn kind of reflected, began to organize and reflected the Watchtower in miniature, and the way the Watchtower was set up under Russell in its early days. And they had a Dawn family. They had a here, let me put in a picture of the Dawn family. They had a Dawn family like the Watchtower Bethel family. And here's a photograph of one of the early iterations of the Dawn family. I know some of these people. The guy's kneeling. The one on the right was Arthur Crumpled. The one on the left was Peter Koloman. The guy who's standing all the way to the left is Christian Zanow. You could find him in that list of Pilgrim speakers in 1929. Next to him is Norman Woodworth. And I see a number of others in here. I can't... The photograph is a little small, and I didn't... Arthur Crumpled's wife is standing behind him. On the right, she's got the big buttons that go all the way down. I knew her fairly well. They were nice people. My parents entertained them all the time. Now, the funny thing about Arthur Crumpled, he was a lifelong Dawner. He worked at the Dawn until he died. He was a pressman. And same with Peter Koloman. Peter Koloman was a pressman. He moved to the United States when he was 6 years old, yet he spoke with such a thick German accent you could hardly understand him. You would have thought that he would have shed the accent from childhood, being in the U.S. all his life, but he still spoke with a thick German accent, not a brogue, thick accent. I'm trying to think of who some of these others are. I can't see them very well, but I do know some of these. But this is in the early days of the Dawn, fairly early days. It's about 10 years, 12 years after the formation of the Dawn in 1932. My grandmother was Woodworth's secretary at that time. She had been his personal secretary at the Dawn for 25 years. My grandfather, neither my grandmother nor my grandfather in this picture, they didn't live at the Dawn. They worked at the Dawn independently. Yeah, I'm trying to. That looks like Gene Burns in the back. That young kid in the back looks like Gene Burns. Oh yeah, Woodworth's second wife. Right in front of the man with the hat holding the hat with the tie. Just in front of him and to his left, I would imagine, um, is Norman Woodworth's wife, second wife. She was Swiss and a masseuse, so that was his second wife at that point. Woodworth never really ever worked a day in his life. I mean, he worked for the Watchtower, but he never had a real job. He always worked at the Dawn. He was the managing editor, and he wrote all the articles. He managed the Dawn, managed the budget, managed the spending. He was the Russell of the Dawn. He was the C.T. Russell equivalent of the Dawn. My grandfather, who was very close to him, once relayed a story to me about Woodworth. And Woodworth said, as a very young man, when he was at the Bethel, they were in a crowded room, I guess, after a meeting, and he caught, out of the corner of his eye, he caught Russell across the room staring at him, staring him down. And he got the distinct impression that he was being sized up by Russell, with the distinct impression, is this the man that is going to run the Watchtower? So, yep, this is the very early Bible student movement as it reformed in the early 1930s. Christian Zainal, that man with the hat, was instrumental. He was a very important pilgrim speaker for the Dawn. The Dawn also had pilgrim speakers. They used the same terminology. They were as much as possible a reflection of the Watchtower under Russell as could be. The Dawn were very much what you would call orthodox Bible students or orthodox Watchtower. They restored the original belief system. They stopped the clock doctrinally at 1916 when Russell died. So I have another picture here that I'm going to show. Now, this is a photograph taken some years later, either the late 1950s or early 1960s. The Dawn had expanded its radio work using the Frank and Ernest format through the 40s. It had hundreds of stations throughout the United States. As the Bible student movement grew, Dawn could afford to incorporate increasing numbers of the stations that broadcast the Frank and Ernest radio program. And I believe the radio program was about a half an hour long. And again, it was a question and answer forum. I met Wilson. George Wilson was a close friend of my grandfather's and his wife. They were both very close to my grandparents, and as was Woodworth, and as were these gentlemen here in this photograph. Now, in the center is Norman Woodworth. He's quite a bit older there. And on the right is G.R. Pollock. And again, if you look at that list in the 1929 yearbook, you'll find Pollock's name. He's the man to the right, all the way to the right. And the gentleman on the left is Ed Fay. And he's got a little less white hair than Woodworth. and Pollock. Now, Pollock was the one that went to jail as a young man for his conscientious objection, and he was the one that was always spoke to us kids about being conscientious objectors when I was growing up. Now, he died around 1976. Norman Woodworth died toward the end, October 29, only 2 days off of Russell's death. He died October 29, 1975. And Ed Fay lived into the 1980s. And he was a sick man. He had some form of leukemia, bruised very easily, and he passed away. Now, Ed Fay was very instrumental. These three gentlemen were part of what they called the Bible Answers work. Now, the Bible Answers was a television version of Frank and Ernest, really. And Pollock on the right was the moderator, and you had Woodworth as a scholar, and Ed Fay was also identified as a Bible scholar. And these were half-hour television shows. You can download these from the Dawn website, and I'll put the Dawn link on. But these guys were very instrumental in the putting together and keeping a movement cohesive after the Watchtower, post-Watchtower association. And so the Bible Students movement, it thrived for quite a while after many of them were disassociated from the Watchtower Society. So, and I knew each one of them. Yes, I was a young man when they passed on. But I did know them, and I knew them fairly well through my grandfather. Pollock had a booming voice, very commanding style. He was located at the Los Angeles Bible Students class. Woodworth was New York Bible Students and the Dawn. The Dawn eventually moved out of Brooklyn. They originated in Brooklyn, and then they moved out of Brooklyn to Rutherford, New Jersey in 1945, and they bought a home in Rutherford, and I'll show you a picture of that. But before I do, I wanted to show you a picture of the Dawn publishing outfit in Rutherford, New Jersey. After they moved from Brooklyn, and they were actually pretty close to the Watchtower in Brooklyn. The Watchtower actually expanded to take a large part of Brooklyn itself in Brooklyn Heights. So wherever you went in Brooklyn, you were bound to, if you threw a stone, you were bound to hit a Jehovah's Witness. So I think that was partly the reason why they wanted to move out of Brooklyn. And they found this old bank in East Rutherford, New Jersey, literally a stone's throw from Rutherford. This bank was built in the 1870s, and they converted it into a printing plant. And they built in the back a warehouse to stockpile supplies, papers, and such. And this is where all the printing was done. They did the linotyping, they did the printing, then they bought themselves a 4-color offset printer where they could run millions of impressions of all different sorts. They printed tracts and books, and they actually reprinted the studies in the scriptures, the daily manna, Songs in the Night, countless booklets, uh, and tracts. Many tracts were printed by the Dawn, and they kept pretty busy. I think the Dawn family at its largest was probably 30, 40 people strong, maybe more at its peak. They had two homes that they housed their volunteer work. Again, the people who worked at the Dawn were volunteers, and they were put up with room and board and a small stipend. The stipend at the time I worked at the Dawn, lived and worked at the Dawn, was $150 a month. My wife was the cook for the Dawn, and she cooked lunch and dinner for the Dawn family. Um, and for the annual meeting, which would have as many as 100 people or so that would come for the annual meeting, which was the first weekend of November of every year. This picture obviously is an old one. Now this building is surrounded by giant condominiums that dwarf it. And that little park is missing. There's a new park in its place with a gazebo, and it looks a little bit different. But overall, the building hasn't changed too much. The terracotta roof is gone. They did replace that in the 1980s with a regular roof. They were having problems with the roof leaking and never being able to fix that. But yeah, this is the Dawn plant, and this is the Dawn home. It was directly across from Fairleigh Dickinson University. Fairleigh Dickinson is no longer there. I think it's a university now. It's a Catholic college. Can't think of the name of it right now, but it's no longer Fairleigh Dickinson University. But right across the street was the original campus of Fairleigh Dickinson. This house was the home that my wife and I lived in. This is where the Dawn family ate. And they had it divided up into individual rooms that they gave the workers. There was a communal area downstairs in the living room with a TV set. There was a communal kitchen. Also, it was a professional kitchen that my wife worked in. She was the chef for the Dawn for 10 years. I also went to college while we were both worked at the Dawn. I maintained the homes in the house. They had two homes. This was the first of two in Rutherford that they bought. And this house was built in 1870, and there was a carriage house in the back with a turntable for the horse carriage to turn the carriage around. It had a little a stable in the back. The hay was still even in there for the horse, and it had an upstairs where they stored stuff like an attic. It was quite a big structure, that carriage house. This house originally belonged to a senator. I'm not quite sure. His name was Van Winkle, Senator Van Winkle. I think he was a state senator for New Jersey. I don't think he was a U.S. senator. But this home was on the historic houses list in Rutherford, and the Dawn still owns it and still houses individuals in there. In the back, they added a little more space as the Dawn family grew. They added apartments during the 1990s in the back. So it was expanded a little bit more than what you see here. My wife and I had a small apartment for us and our two daughters, on the third floor, and the washroom, for the laundry, um, was in the basement. So we had to go 3 flights, pretty long flights, to get down to the basement. The interior was all done in oak paneling, 1870s oak paneling. It was beautiful, and above the fireplace, none of the fireplaces are functional, but they had numbers of fireplaces, and the above the fireplace in the main dining room where everybody ate communally, we had family-style dinner. Everybody sat together, and we had a prayer before dinner, and then apparently things lightened up a little bit by the time we were there. There were a lot of young people, and so talking was permitted at dinner, but I understand it. For many years, talking was not permitted during dinner. There was a big painting of Charles Russell hanging in the dining room over the fireplace, so his presence was constantly there. And every so often, we would get a visit from a Jehovah's Witness trying to sell us their wares, their Watchtower magazine. And it happened when my wife would be alone working, and she'd invite them in and show them the painting of Charles Russell, and said that that was the dawn home, and consequently that was about as far as the witness would go, and they would run out of the door. Jehovah's Witnesses who knew about Bible students and about the dawn were very wary of the dawn. So this is a little of the history of the dawn. One last thing that I wanted to discuss is the Dawn magazine. Now, when the Frank and Ernest radio was first broadcast, they also advertised a magazine, a companion magazine, and they called that magazine Radio Echoes. And it was to allow those who heard the Frank and Ernest radio broadcast to be able to contact the Dawn and find out where they could meet with other brethren, other Bible student brethren. Within a very short time, the Radio Echoes magazine was transformed into the Dawn magazine, and the reason for that, I think, is because the New York Bible students ecclesia could only come up with money for 13 broadcasts, which didn't allow for them to broadcast very long over the radio. It did reach the entire metropolitan area, and there was a great number of people that did respond, and they responded to the Radio Echoes and then subscribed to the Radio Echoes magazine, so that it transformed into the Dawn magazine. And they had money to continue publishing the magazine. They didn't have enough money until 1938, about 5-6 years later, to begin rebroadcasting on the radio. So it wasn't until 1938, the year my grandparents both were baptized and consecrated and baptized into the Bible students. My mother was baptized in 1941 with a whole slew of young people in her age. I think she was about 14 at the time, 14, 15 years old when she was baptized into the Bible students. But my grandparents, they were in their late 30s when, let's see, my grandfather would have been 38, and my grandmother was 34. So at the time, and she immediately became Woodworth's secretary at the Dawn. But the Dawn magazine was published from around 1932 to the present time. You can still find the Dawn magazine on the Dawn website. All you have to do is type into Google Dawn Bible students, and the first thing that pops up is the Dawn website. I made that website back in the 1990s, 1997. So if it looks dated, it is. I'll tell you the story some other time about how hard it was to get them to go into the internet, and they haven't really done a whole lot with the website since I created it back in 1996. And so that's how long this website's been up, and almost exactly the same format. You can see that they haven't really taken it too much further. They've done a few things. You can download digitalized Frank and Ernest radio, or I don't, not the Frank and Ernest, but the Bible Answers television programs. You can download those. You can open those up as streaming media. But they're very dated. They're 1950s, 1960s. I think the latest, they may have, I think that they are creationists, New Earth creationists. They buy the 49,000 year creation idea, and they have a magazine or a broadcast on create. They have a magazine, a booklet on creation. And they also have a Bible Answers television video on creation. So they're kind of entertaining, but they have old streaming media from the 60s. There's one that I think is kind of entertaining. The Bible students at the World's Fair, they show the 1964-1965 World's Fair. They show the booth there that the Dawn Bible students had set up, and at some point maybe I'll put that up online. But I've gone a long time now, and I'll pick up on the history of the Bible students. But yeah, this was the beginning of the Bible student movement. I have other information that indicates that by the mid-1940s, the movement was about 56,000 strong. And so I'll put up that evidence for that. It's a court trial document where Norman Woodworth, there was a tax dispute between the Dawn and the town of East Rutherford, and $27,000 dispute. And the Dawn actually lost the lawsuit, but in it, Woodworth was asked to explain to the judge what the Bible students movement was, because he hadn't heard of them. And Woodworth mentioned that there were 56,000 Bible students, and so yeah, it kind of hangs together with William Schnell's numbers, the numbers that are on JW Facts, the pre-split memorial numbers show, 90,000, maybe 50,000 of them were consecrated, baptized, anointed brethren, and those, the Dawn recouped quite a number of them. So anyway, so that was some of the key players. That's some of the history that took place. These were associates of Charles Taze Russell. They were associates, and workers at the Bethel and at the Watchtower until the late 1920s, when finally doctrinal splits, doctrinal matters caused them to leave. Okay, so I'll pick it up next time with a little more detail, a little more of the history, some more photographs. My grandfather has tons of photographs. I'll talk about the General Convention next time. Bible students began holding an annual General Convention, and that is a major feature of Bible student life. In fact, this week is the General Convention for Bible students, and you can see it live on both YouTube and on you can see it streaming live on Adobe if you have Adobe Connect. So there are two ways of seeing the what a Bible student convention's about, and things haven't changed a heck of a lot. I was watching some this morning, and it's about the same. So anyway, this is Truth Seeker. This has been a very long video. I'm gonna give you a break right now. So take care, everybody, and thank you for putting up with me.